The dust-choked streets of Fort Laramie, Wyoming Territory seemed to hold their breath as Captain Richard Thornton dismounted his cavalry horse and fixed his cold blue eyes on the young woman standing outside the general store, her worn calico dress doing nothing to diminish the striking beauty of her determined face. It was the summer of 1876, and Sarah Catherine Brennan had arrived in the Wyoming Territory just 3 weeks prior, fleeing the suffocating expectations of her aunt's Boston household after her parents had perished in a tenement fire the previous winter. At 22 years old, she had used the last of her meager inheritance to purchase passage west, drawn by advertisements seeking schoolteachers for the frontier settlements. Her honey-colored hair, pinned carefully beneath a simple bonnet, gleamed in the unforgiving sunlight, and her green eyes held both intelligence and a stubborn independence that most men found either fascinating or deeply threatening. Captain Thornton clearly fell into the former category. He had been watching her for days, making his interest known through lingering stares and unwelcome visits to the small boarding house where Sarah rented a cramped room on the second floor. At 35, he was a career military man, impeccably groomed despite the harsh conditions of frontier life, with a rigid bearing that suggested he viewed the world as something to be commanded and controlled. His uniform was always pristine, his dark hair slicked back with pomade, and his thin lips rarely curved into anything resembling genuine warmth. "Miss Brennan," he called out, his voice carrying the clipped authority of someone accustomed to immediate obedience. "A word, if you please." Sarah clutched her small parcel of supplies more tightly and turned to face him, though every instinct screamed at her to simply walk away. She had learned quickly that defying an officer of the United States Cavalry in a territory still volatile with conflicts between settlers, soldiers, and the native tribes could bring consequences she was ill-equipped to handle. Still, she lifted her chin and met his gaze directly. "Captain Thornton, I am rather busy this afternoon. I have lessons to prepare for tomorrow." He closed the distance between them with measured steps, each bootfall deliberate. "Your dedication to educating these frontier children is admirable, Miss Brennan, but surely you can spare a few moments for a conversation that concerns your future welfare." A knot of dread formed in Sarah's stomach. She had sensed this confrontation building, had felt the weight of his attention growing heavier with each passing day. The other women at the boarding house, wives of tradesmen and soldiers, had whispered warnings about Captain Thornton's reputation. He was a man who decided what he wanted and pursued it with the same strategic precision he applied to military campaigns. "I assure you, Captain, my future welfare is quite secure. The Territorial School Board has offered me a position, and I have every intention of fulfilling my duties." Sarah started to move past him, but he shifted his position, blocking her path without actually touching her. "You misunderstand me, Miss Brennan. Your current situation is hardly suitable for a woman of your obvious refinement. Living in that dilapidated boarding house, teaching half-wild children for a pittance, facing the dangers of this territory without proper protection. It is my duty, as an officer and a gentleman, to offer you an alternative." Sarah felt her breath catch. "An alternative?" "Marriage, Miss Brennan. I'm proposing that you become my wife." The words hung in the hot air between them, and Sarah felt the weight of eyes upon them. Several townspeople had slowed their activities to watch this exchange, understanding that something significant was unfolding. In the rigid social hierarchy of a frontier military outpost, a proposal from Captain Thornton was not merely a personal matter, but a public declaration. "Captain Thornton, I am honored by your regard, but I must respectfully decline. I came west to build an independent life, not to exchange one form of obligation for another." Sarah kept her voice steady, though her heart hammered against her ribs. His expression hardened, the veneer of gentlemanly courtesy cracking to reveal something colder beneath. "You decline? Miss Brennan, perhaps you do not fully comprehend your situation. This is not Boston, where a young woman might have numerous options in the protection of established society. This is the frontier, where a woman alone is vulnerable to countless dangers. I am offering you security, status, and my protection. To refuse such an offer is not merely foolish, but potentially disastrous. Nevertheless, Captain, my answer remains no. I do not wish to marry you, now or in the future. Sarah spoke more loudly this time, wanting witnesses to hear her clear refusal. Captain Thornton's jaw tightened, and his hand moved to rest on the pommel of his cavalry saber in a gesture that might have been unconscious but felt deeply threatening. "You will reconsider, Miss Brennan. I will give you 1 week to reflect upon your answer. I strongly advise you to think carefully about the consequences of continued refusal. A word from me could make your position here untenable. The school board relies heavily on the approval of the military command. Your teaching position could easily be deemed inappropriate or unnecessary." The threat was barely veiled, and Sarah felt anger flare hot in her chest, burning away some of her fear. "Are you threatening my livelihood because I will not marry you, Captain? I am merely pointing out realities, Miss Brennan. 1 week. I will expect your revised answer then." He touched the brim of his hat in a mockery of polite farewell and strode away, his back rigid with barely contained fury. Sarah stood frozen for a long moment, her hands trembling around her parcel. She became aware of the sympathetic glances from some of the townswomen and the calculating looks from others who clearly thought her a fool for refusing such an advantageous match. She forced herself to walk with measured dignity back toward the boarding house, but once inside her small room, she sank onto the narrow bed and pressed her hands to her face. She had not escaped Boston's constraints, only to find herself trapped in a different kind of cage. Yet, Captain Thornton's threat was real. She had no family, no connections, no resources beyond her teaching salary. If he made good on his implied promise to have her dismissed, she would have no means of supporting herself. The thought of returning east in defeat was unbearable, but the thought of marrying a man who viewed her as property to be acquired was equally intolerable. The following days passed in a haze of anxiety. Sarah threw herself into her teaching duties, finding solace in the eager faces of the dozen children who attended the makeshift school in the back room of the fort's chapel. She taught them reading and arithmetic, geography and history, trying to open windows to a wider world even as her own world seemed to be closing in. Captain Thornton made his presence felt constantly. He appeared at the school during lessons, standing in the doorway with his arms crossed, watching her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. He arranged to be at the boarding house dining table during meals, engaging her in conversations that were superficially polite but laden with undertones of possession and threat. He sent his orderly to deliver flowers and small gifts that Sarah refused to accept. The other women at the boarding house were divided in their reactions. Mrs. Henderson, the elderly widow who ran the establishment, clucked her tongue and advised Sarah to accept the proposal. "You will not receive a better offer, my dear. Captain Thornton is a respected man with an assured future. What more could you want?" But Molly Chen, a young woman whose Chinese immigrant father ran the fort's laundry, pulled Sarah aside one evening and spoke in an urgent whisper. "Do not let him bully you into this marriage. I have seen how he treats those beneath him. He is a cruel man who hides it well behind his uniform and manners. If you marry him, you will regret it every day of your life." Sarah knew Molly spoke truth, but knowing it did not solve her dilemma. The week Captain Thornton had given her was nearly expired, and she had no plan, no escape, no alternative to offer when he demanded her final answer. It was on the 6th day, when desperation had begun to feel like a physical weight crushing her chest, that she first saw the mountain man. She had ventured beyond the immediate confines of the fort, seeking a brief respite from the claustrophobic attention. The rolling prairie stretched endlessly in all directions, broken only by the dark line of mountains rising in the distance. Sarah walked along the creek that supplied the fort with water, following a worn path that offered shade from the cottonwood trees growing along the banks. She had paused to rest on a sun-warmed boulder when she heard the sound of hoofbeats and looked up to see a rider approaching from the direction of the mountains. Even at a distance, she could tell this was no soldier. The man sat his horse with an easy confidence that spoke of years in the saddle, and as he drew closer, Sarah found herself staring with unabashed curiosity. He was massive, easily over 6 feet tall, with shoulders so broad they seemed to block out the sun. His buckskin shirt stretched across a chest heavy with muscle, and his forearms, bare to the elbow, showed the corded strength of someone who made his living through physical labor in an unforgiving land. He wore his dark hair longer than was fashionable, touching his shoulders in waves that suggested he cut it himself without concern for style. His face was weathered by sun and wind, angular and strong, with a jaw covered by several days' growth of beard. But it was his eyes that caught and held her attention, a startling gray blue that seemed to see everything with a clarity that made her feel suddenly, acutely visible. He slowed his horse as he approached, and Sarah belatedly realized she should perhaps be frightened. She was alone, beyond sight of the fort, and this man was clearly more comfortable in the wilderness than in civilization. Yet she felt no fear, only an intense, curious awareness. "Afternoon, ma'am," he said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to resonate in her chest. He touched the brim of his worn hat in a gesture far more natural than Captain Thornton's affected courtesy. "You are quite a ways from the fort." "I needed some air," Sarah replied, then felt foolish. Of course there was air everywhere. I wanted some solitude." His lips curved slightly, not quite a smile, but suggesting amusement. "Solitude is one thing this territory offers in abundance." He studied her for a moment, and Sarah had the unsettling feeling that he was reading her current distress as easily as she might read one of her school books. "Though I am not sure solitude is the same as safety for a woman alone this far from the settlement." "Are you suggesting I should be afraid of you, Mr.?" Sarah found herself bristling at the implied criticism, even though she knew he was probably right. Boone, Jacob Boone, though most folks just call me Boone." He dismounted in one fluid motion, and Sarah revised her estimate of his height upward. He was enormous, at least 6'3", with the kind of build that came from years of hauling traps, chopping wood, and surviving in the wilderness. "And no, ma'am, you should not be afraid of me. But there are others who travel these parts who would not be so respectful of a lady alone." "I am perfectly capable of taking care of myself," Sarah said, lifting her chin even as she recognized the absurdity of the claim. She had no weapon, no means of defending herself, no real knowledge of the dangers that lurked beyond the fort's palisade walls. Boone regarded her with those penetrating eyes, and this time his smile was full and genuine, transforming his rough features into something surprisingly attractive. "I do not doubt you have spirit, ma'am, but spirit alone will not stop a hungry cougar or a band of raiders. May I ask what brings a lady of obvious education and refinement to Fort Laramie?" "I'm a schoolteacher," Sarah said, surprised to find herself wanting to talk to this stranger. There was something about his calm, steady presence that invited confidence. "I came west to teach." "Noble work," Boone said, and he sounded as though he meant it. He led his horse to the creek to drink, moving with an economy of motion that spoke of perfect comfort in his body and his surroundings. "Are you planning to make the territory your permanent home?" "That was my intention," Sarah admitted, then felt her throat tighten. "Though circumstances may force a change in my plans." Boone glanced at her sharply. "What circumstances?" Sarah hesitated, then found the words spilling out before she could stop them. Perhaps it was the isolation of the moment, or the fact that this stranger had no connection to the fort's social dynamics, or simply that she desperately needed to voice her fears to someone. "There is an officer at the fort, Captain Thornton. He has decided he wants me as his wife, and has made it clear that refusal will result in consequences I cannot afford." The transformation in Boone was subtle but unmistakable. His relaxed posture tensed, and his eyes went cold in a way that reminded Sarah he was a man who had survived in one of the harshest environments on earth. "He is forcing you to marry him?" He phrases it as a proposal, but yes, the element of coercion is quite clear. He has threatened my teaching position, and without that, I have no means of supporting myself. Sarah wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly feeling the vulnerability of her position. "Tomorrow is the deadline he gave me for my answer." Boone was silent for a long moment, his gaze distant as though considering something. When he spoke again, his voice was carefully neutral. "What would you do if you had a real choice? If there were no threats, no pressure, what would you choose?" "I would choose freedom," Sarah said immediately. "I would choose to build my own life on my own terms, to teach, to be independent. I did not come all this way just to become some man's possession." "Then you should not marry him," Boone said simply, as though it were the most obvious thing in the world. "But you do not understand. He will ruin me. He will have me dismissed, and then what will I do? I have no money, no family, nowhere to go." The desperation Sarah had been holding at bay for days threatened to overwhelm her. "There are always choices, ma'am. even when it does not seem that way. Boone moved closer, though he maintained a respectful distance. A woman has as much right to choose her own path as any man. No officer, no matter his rank, has the right to force your hand through threats and intimidation. That's a fine sentiment, Mr. Boone, but sentiment does not solve my practical problems. Sarah heard the bitterness in her own voice. Perhaps not, but running toward a bad situation because you are running away from your current troubles is a poor strategy for survival. Boone tilted his head, studying her. How much time do you have before you must give this Captain Thornton your answer? He expects my response tomorrow afternoon. Boone nodded slowly. Then you have tonight to think on it. But I will tell you this, Miss Brennan, Sarah Brennan. Miss Brennan, in my experience, a person who will use threats and coercion to get what they want before marriage will only become worse after the vows are spoken. You would be tying yourself to a man who sees you as property, not a partner. That is a hard road, and it rarely leads anywhere worth going. His words resonated deep in Sarah's chest, because they articulated what she had been trying not to fully acknowledge. Still, she shook her head. Your words may be true, but they do not change my situation. Maybe not, Boone agreed, but sometimes knowing the truth of something is the first step toward finding a way forward. He gathered his horse's reins. I should let you return to the fort before someone notices you are gone and raises an alarm. But Miss Brennan, I want you to know something. If you decide you need help, if you need someone to stand with you when you tell that captain your answer is no, you can find me at the trading post on the north edge of the fort. I will be there through tomorrow, selling my furs and restocking supplies before heading back into the mountains. Why would you help me? You do not even know me. Sarah searched his face, looking for ulterior motives but finding only sincerity. Because a woman deserves the right to choose her own future, Boone said quietly. My mother had that choice stolen from her, forced into a marriage she never wanted. I watched it break her spirit long before illness took her body. I swore then that if I ever had the power to help a woman in a similar situation, I would do it. He mounted his horse in that same fluid motion. The choice is yours, Miss Brennan, but know that you are not as alone as you think you are. He touched his hat brim once more and rode off toward the fort, leaving Sarah standing by the creek with her thoughts in turmoil. The encounter had lasted perhaps 20 minutes, but it had fundamentally shifted something in her perspective. For the first time since Captain Thornton had made his threatening proposal, Sarah felt a flicker of something that might have been hope. She returned to the boarding house as the sun began its descent toward the mountains, her mind churning with possibilities and fears. That evening, she barely touched her dinner, ignoring Mrs. Henderson's pointed comments about young women needing to maintain their strength and appearance. Captain Thornton, mercifully, was absent from the meal, reportedly occupied with some military matter beyond the fort. That night, Sarah lay awake in her narrow bed, staring at the ceiling and listening to the sounds of the fort settling into uneasy sleep. She thought about Captain Thornton's cold eyes and controlled fury when she had initially refused him. She thought about the life that awaited her as his wife, a life of suffocating propriety and suppressed will. She thought about her parents, who had loved each other deeply despite their poverty, and how her mother had always told her that a marriage without respect and genuine affection was a living death. And she thought about Jacob Boone, the mountain man with kind eyes and a core of unmistakable strength, who had offered help without demanding anything in return, who had spoken of her right to choose as though it were self-evident rather than radical. By the time dawn light began filtering through her small window, Sarah had made her decision. She would refuse Captain Thornton, clearly and publicly, and she would accept whatever consequences came from that refusal. Perhaps it was foolish, perhaps it would lead to disaster, but at least it would be her choice, her decision, her life to live or ruin as she saw fit. The morning dragged with excruciating slowness. Sarah taught her lessons mechanically, her mind already focused on the confrontation to come. She had told Captain Thornton she would meet him at 3 o'clock in the afternoon outside the fort commander's office, a location he had chosen specifically for its public nature and implicit authority. At 2:30, Sarah changed from her teaching dress into her best outfit, a simple but well-made gray dress with modest trim. She pinned her hair carefully and took several deep breaths to steady her nerves. Then, on impulse, she detoured to the trading post on the north edge of the fort. The trading post, was a ramshackle building that smelled of tobacco, leather, and furs. Behind the rough wooden counter stood a grizzled man with one eye and a suspicious expression. Several other men lounged around the small space, trappers and traders who eyed Sarah with curiosity as she entered. "I'm looking for Jacob Boone," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Outside," the one-eyed man grunted, jerking his thumb toward the rear of the building, around back with his pelts. Sarah found him exactly where the trader had indicated, checking over a stack of beaver and fox pelts spread on a makeshift table. He looked up at her approach, and something flickered in his eyes. Surprise, perhaps, or maybe satisfaction. "Miss Brennan," he said, straightening to his full impressive height, "I was not sure I would see you again." "I am refusing him," Sarah said without preamble. "I am about to meet Captain Thornton and tell him definitively that I will not marry him, regardless of the consequences. But I wanted you to know, in case your offer of support was genuine." A slow smile spread across Boone's weathered face. It was entirely genuine. "When are you meeting this captain?" "In 15 minutes, outside the commander's office." "Then we should not keep him waiting." Boone rolled down his shirt sleeves and reached for the leather vest hanging on a nearby post. As he shrugged into it, Sarah could not help but notice again the sheer physical presence of the man, the way his muscles moved beneath the fabric, the aura of capable strength that surrounded him like a cloak. They walked together through the fort, and Sarah was acutely aware of the attention their pairing drew. A proper schoolteacher walking with a rough mountain man was unusual enough to warrant stares and whispers. Sarah lifted her chin and ignored them all, focusing on putting one foot in front of the other as her heart hammered against her ribs. Captain Thornton was already waiting, standing at parade rest with his hands clasped behind his back. His expression was confident, almost smug, as though he had no doubt about the outcome of this meeting. That confidence faltered visibly when he saw Boone walking beside Sarah. "Miss Brennan," he said coolly, his eyes flicking dismissively over Boone before returning to Sarah. "I see you have brought company to what should be a private conversation. On the contrary, Captain, you chose this very public location for our meeting. Mr. Boone is here as my friend and support." Sarah was proud that her voice came out steady and clear. Thornton's jaw tightened. "Very well. I assume you have considered my proposal carefully and have come to the sensible conclusion." "I have considered your proposal very carefully, Captain Thornton, and my answer is the same as it was when you first made your demand. I will not marry you, not now, not ever. I do not love you, I do not wish to be your wife, and I refuse to be coerced into a union that would make me miserable." Sarah spoke loudly enough that the soldiers and civilians within earshot could hear every word. Thornton's face flushed dark red, and his hands clenched at his sides. "You refuse? Even knowing the consequences? Miss Brennan, you are making a grave mistake." "The only mistake would be marrying a man who views me as property to be acquired rather than a person with her own will and desires," Sarah replied. "I came west to be free, Captain, and I will not trade that freedom for the illusion of security you offer." "You call it an illusion?" Thornton took a step forward, his voice rising. "I offer you everything, a respected position, a home, protection, and you throw it back in my face for what? To remain a penniless schoolteacher living in squalor? Or perhaps you have other arrangements in mind?" His gaze slid to Boone with undisguised contempt. "Is that it? You have found a different protector? I see you have already taken up with this savage." Boone moved then, not quickly, but with the deliberate intensity of a large predator. He positioned himself slightly in front of Sarah, not protectively so much as making his presence impossible to ignore. When he spoke, his voice was low and even, but it carried a weight that made several nearby soldiers shift nervously. "You will speak respectfully to Miss Brennan, Captain. She has given you her answer clearly and honestly. A gentleman would accept her decision with grace." "A gentleman?" Thornton laughed harshly. "And what would you know about being a gentleman, mountain man? You are nothing but an uneducated brute who lives like an animal in the wilderness. Miss Brennan, is this truly the company you prefer to mine? This ignorant savage?" "Mr. Boone has shown me more genuine respect in one day than you have in 3 weeks, Captain," Sarah said, her anger burning through her fear. "He has not threatened me, coerced me, or treated me as though my wishes were irrelevant. Whatever you think of his way of life, he understands something you apparently cannot grasp, that a woman has the right to choose her own path. Choose your path? Thornton sneered. You foolish girl. You have no path without my protection. I will ensure the school board dismisses you immediately. I will make certain every respectable family in this fort knows you are unsuitable company. You will be ruined, unable to find work or shelter. Is that the choice you want? Better that than a lifetime shackled to a man who would threaten and bully me into submission? Sarah shot back. Thornton's hand moved toward his saber, and instantly Boone's entire demeanor changed. He did not reach for a weapon, did not make any overtly threatening move. But suddenly, he seemed to grow larger, more dangerous, coiled and ready. Several soldiers who had been watching the confrontation tensed, clearly uncertain whether they should intervene. I would not do that, Captain, Boone said softly. You are angry, I understand that. But threatening a woman because she will not marry you is beneath even a poor excuse for an officer. How dare you? Thornton hissed. I could have you arrested for insubordination, for threatening a military officer. I am not under your command, Captain. I am a civilian, and I have threatened no one. I am simply standing with a woman who has the right to refuse a marriage proposal, even when that refusal offends your pride. Boone's voice remained calm, but his eyes were hard as flint. A new voice cut through the tension. What is the meaning of this disturbance? Everyone turned to see Colonel Mackenzie, the fort commander, emerging from his office with an expression of severe displeasure. He was a grizzled veteran in his 50s, with iron-gray hair and the weathered face of someone who had spent decades dealing with the complexities of frontier military life. Captain Thornton immediately snapped to attention. Colonel, I was simply speaking with Miss Brennan about a personal matter when this civilian interfered. It did not sound like a personal conversation, Captain. It sounded like a public argument. Colonel Mackenzie turned his gaze to Sarah. Miss Brennan, perhaps you would care to explain what is happening here. Sarah took a deep breath, aware that this moment could define her future. Colonel, Captain Thornton asked me to marry him. I declined his proposal. He has responded to my refusal by threatening to have me dismissed from my teaching position and to ruin my reputation unless I reconsider. I came here today to make it absolutely clear that my answer is no, regardless of any threats he might make. The colonel's expression darkened as he looked at Thornton. Captain, is this true? Have you been threatening Miss Brennan? I merely pointed out the realities of her situation. Sir, a woman alone on the frontier faces many difficulties. I was attempting to make her see sense. Thornton's voice was stiff, defensive. By threatening her livelihood and reputation? Captain Thornton, that is not the behavior I expect from my officers. Colonel Mackenzie's tone was sharp. Miss Brennan's teaching position is a civilian matter, overseen by the Territorial School Board, not by military command. You have no authority to interfere with her employment, and any attempt to do so will reflect poorly on this entire post. But, sir, I only meant— What you meant, Captain, is that you wished to coerce Miss Brennan into marriage by making her feel she had no alternative. That is dishonorable conduct. The colonel turned to Sarah. Miss Brennan, you have my assurance that your teaching position will not be affected by this matter. Captain Thornton will make no further attempts to threaten or intimidate you. Is that clear, Captain? Thornton's face had gone from red to white, his humiliation obvious. Yes, sir, he said through clenched teeth. Furthermore, Captain, you will apologize to Miss Brennan for your conduct. For a moment, Sarah thought Thornton might refuse, might push his pride past the breaking point. But he was a career military man, and disobeying a direct order from his commanding officer was apparently a line he would not cross. My apologies, Miss Brennan, he said, the words obviously tasting like ash in his mouth. I overstepped appropriate bounds. Apology noted, Captain, Sarah replied coolly. She had no intention of making this easier for him. Colonel Mackenzie nodded. Captain, you are dismissed. Report to my office at 0600 tomorrow. We will discuss this matter further. It was clear from his tone that the discussion would not be pleasant for Thornton. As Thornton stalked away, his back rigid with fury and embarrassment, Sarah felt her knees go weak with relief. The confrontation she had been dreading was over, and she had emerged with her dignity intact and her position secure. Miss Brennan, the colonel said more gently, I apologize on behalf of the United States Army for Captain Thornton's behavior. It is inexcusable. If he troubles you again in any way, you are to report it to me immediately." "Thank you, Colonel. I appreciate your support." Sarah managed a shaky smile. Colonel Mackenzie glanced at Boone, who had remained silent throughout the exchange. "Jacob Boone, I should have known you would be involved in this somehow. You have a habit of turning up when someone needs help." "Colonel," Boone acknowledged with a slight nod, "I was merely providing moral support to Miss Brennan." "Moral support," the Colonel repeated with a hint of amusement. "Well, I cannot fault you for that. Miss Brennan made a wise choice in seeking your company over Thornton's. That man has always had more ambition than sense." He tipped his hat to Sarah. "Good day to you both." As the Colonel returned to his office and the gathered crowd began to disperse, Sarah turned to Boone and felt sudden tears prick her eyes. The emotional strain of the past week seemed to crash over her all at once. "Thank you," she whispered. "I could not have done that without you here." "Yes, you could have," Boone said firmly. "You are stronger than you think, Miss Brennan. I just stood beside you. You did the hard part yourself." Even so, knowing I was not alone made all the difference. Sarah wiped at her eyes with the back of her hand. "I am being foolish, crying when I should be celebrating." "You are not being foolish. You have been under tremendous pressure. Tears are a natural response." Boone's voice was gentle, and when Sarah looked up at him, she saw understanding in those gray-blue eyes, compassion without pity. "What do I do now?" Sarah asked, the question emerging before she could think better of it. "I have kept my teaching position, but Captain Thornton will remain at this fort. He will not forgive this humiliation. How do I live here knowing he hates me?" Boone was quiet for a moment, his expression thoughtful. "That is a valid concern. Men like Thornton do not handle public defeat well. The Colonel's intervention will keep him from overt retaliation, but there are other ways a vindictive man can make someone's life difficult." "Then I have merely traded one impossible situation for another," Sarah said, feeling despair creep back in. "Not impossible, just complicated." Boone glanced toward the mountains rising in the distance. "Miss Brennan, how committed are you to remaining at Fort Laramie specifically?" Sarah blinked at the unexpected question. "I do not understand. My teaching position is here. For now. But there are other communities in the territory, other places that need teachers, and some of those places are far enough from military oversight that Captain Thornton's reach would not extend to them." Boone met her eyes. "I have a cabin in the mountains, about 30 miles north of here. It is near a small settlement, maybe 15 families, trying to establish a mining community. They have children who need educating. I have heard them speak of their need for a teacher." Sarah stared at him. "Are you suggesting I leave Fort Laramie? Just pack up and move to some remote mining settlement?" "I am suggesting it as an option. You have proven today that you are willing to take risks to preserve your independence. Moving to a new community would be a risk, certainly, but it would also be a fresh start, away from Thornton and away from the complications here." Boone shrugged. "Of course, the decision is entirely yours. I am merely offering information about alternatives." The idea was both terrifying and thrilling. To leave the relative safety and structure of Fort Laramie for an uncertain situation in a remote mountain settlement seemed reckless. But then again, staying here, constantly looking over her shoulder for Thornton's next move, knowing that her presence would be a continuing source of tension, held its own dangers. "I do not know anything about this settlement. How would I even get there? What guarantee would I have that they would hire me as a teacher?" Sarah felt overwhelmed by the logistics. "The settlement is called Silver Creek, named for the stream that runs through it. Most of the men are miners, but there are families, women, and children. They are trying to build something permanent, not just chase quick wealth." Boone spoke with the easy knowledge of someone who knew the territory intimately. "As for how you would get there, I'm heading back tomorrow. You could travel with me, under my protection, and as for guarantees, there are none. But I know most of the families there, and I can vouch for you. That would carry weight." "Why would you do this for me? You barely know me." Sarah repeated her earlier question, still searching for the catch, the hidden price. "Because I believe every person deserves the chance to build the life they want, free from threats and coercion," Boone said simply. "And because I recognize courage when I see it. You stood up to Thornton today knowing it could cost you everything. That takes strength of character. People like you make the frontier better, and I want to see you succeed." Sarah looked into his honest face and felt something shift in her chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the afternoon sun. This man, this rough mountain man who lived beyond the edges of civilization, had shown her more kindness and respect than anyone in her supposed refined social circle ever had. "I need time to think about this," she said finally. "It is a major decision, and I cannot make it impulsively." "Of course. I will be at the trading post until mid-morning tomorrow. If you decide to come to Silver Creek, meet me there at dawn. If not, I wish you well, Miss Brennan. Truly." Boone touched his hat brim in that now familiar gesture and walked away, leaving Sarah standing in the dusty fort yard with her thoughts in turmoil. That evening, Sarah sat in her small room and tried to think logically about her options. Stay at Fort Laramie, continue teaching in relative safety but under Thornton's ongoing resentment, or venture into the unknown with a man she had known for barely a day, hoping to build something new in an isolated settlement. Every practical consideration argued for staying. She had a job, a room, a known situation. Yes, Thornton's presence was a complication, but the colonel had made his position clear. She would be protected from overt harassment. But as Sarah sat in the growing darkness, she realized that practical considerations had never been what drove her most important decisions. Practicality had dictated that she stay in Boston, accept a position as a governess or companion, live quietly on the margins of other people's lives. Instead, she had bought a ticket west and plunged into the unknown because she had wanted more than mere survival. She had wanted to live. The question was not whether leaving for Silver Creek was practical. The question was what kind of life she wanted to build for herself. Did she want to stay in a place where she would always be defined by her refusal of Captain Thornton, where she would always feel the weight of his resentment? Or did she want to start fresh, to go somewhere new where she could be judged solely on her own merits? And beneath those questions lay another, one she barely wanted to acknowledge even to herself. In the brief time she had known Jacob Boone, she had felt something awaken in her, an awareness and attraction unlike anything she had experienced before. He was everything Captain Thornton was not, strong without being domineering, confident without arrogance, respectful of her autonomy while offering protection. The thought of seeing him again, of having more time to know him, sent a flutter through her stomach that was part nervousness, part anticipation. By the time the first light of dawn began to gray the eastern sky, Sarah had made her decision. She packed her few belongings into the battered carpet bag she had brought from Boston, left a brief note of explanation and gratitude for Mrs. Henderson, along with the rent money she owed, and slipped out of the boarding house before anyone else stirred. The trading post was just opening when she arrived, and Boone was already there, loading supplies onto a sturdy pack mule. He looked up at her approach, and his face lit with a smile that made him look years younger and impossibly handsome despite his rough appearance. "Miss Brennan, I confess I hoped you would come, but I was not certain you would." "I was not certain either," Sarah admitted, "but I decided that I did not come all the way to Wyoming to play it safe. If I am going to take risks, I might as well take them in pursuit of something I truly want, rather than just avoiding something I fear." "Wise philosophy," Boone said approvingly. He took her carpet bag and secured it with the other supplies. "Are you a confident rider?" "I can manage a gentle horse at a reasonable pace," Sarah said. "I would not call myself an expert." "That will do. The trail to Silver Creek is clear enough, and we will take it slow. There is no rush." Boone led out a second horse, a calm-looking mare with a white blaze on her face. "This is Juniper. She's my spare mount, steady and reliable. She will take good care of you." Sarah approached the mare and stroked her neck, feeling the warm solidity of the animal beneath her hand. "Hello, Juniper. We are going to be friends, you and I." As the sun rose fully above the horizon, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Sarah and Boone rode out of Fort Laramie heading north. Sarah did not look back. She had spent too much of her life looking backward at what she had lost, at what might have been. It was time to look forward toward whatever future she could build for herself. The journey to Silver Creek took 2 days of steady riding through some of the most beautiful country Sarah had ever seen. They followed game trails through rolling prairie that gradually gave way to pine-covered foothills, with the snow-capped peaks of the mountains rising ever more dramatically ahead. Boone proved to be an excellent traveling companion, pointing out landmarks and wildlife, sharing stories of his years in the mountains without dominating the conversation. He asked Sarah about her life in Boston, her parents, her journey west, and he listened with genuine interest to her responses. They made camp the first night beside a small stream, and Sarah watched with fascination as Boone went about the practiced routine of frontier living, building a fire, preparing a simple but satisfying meal of salt pork, beans, and coffee. He insisted she take his bedroll while he wrapped himself in a blanket near the fire, and despite her protests, he would not be moved on the matter. "You are a guest under my protection, Miss Brennan. I would not be much of a protector if I let you sleep on the cold ground while I took the comfortable bedding. You know, Mr. Boone, you keep referring to me as Miss Brennan, but you have been nothing but kind to me. Would you consider calling me Sarah? Miss Brennan sounds so formal given the circumstances." Boone looked at her across the campfire, and something warm flickered in his eyes. "I would be honored, Sarah, and you should call me Boone. Or Jacob, if you prefer, though I've gotten so used to just Boone that I answer to it more readily." "Boone it is," Sarah said with a smile. As she lay in the bedroll looking up at the vast canopy of stars overhead, more stars than she had ever imagined existed, Sarah felt a peace she had not experienced in months. The constant anxiety that had gripped her since Captain Thornton began his pursuit had finally loosened its hold. Out here, under the enormous sky, her problems seemed smaller, more manageable, and the presence of Boone, keeping watch over the camp, made her feel safer than any locked door ever had. The second day of riding was more challenging as they climbed into the mountains proper. The trail grew steeper and narrower, winding through stands of pine and aspen, crossing rocky streams, skirting drop-offs that made Sarah's stomach clench with vertigo. But Juniper lived up to Boone's assessment, moving with careful confidence, and Boone was always nearby, ready to offer a steadying hand or a word of encouragement when the trail grew particularly treacherous. By late afternoon, they crested a ridge and looked down into a valley where Sarah could see a cluster of rough buildings, a few dozen structures scattered along a creek that caught the sunlight and glittered like the precious metal for which it was named. Smoke rose from chimneys, and even at this distance Sarah could hear the faint sounds of hammering and human activity. "Silver Creek," Boone said, and there was affection in his voice. "It is not much to look at, but the people are good, hard-working folk trying to build something lasting. I think you will like it here." They rode down into the valley as the sun began its descent toward the peaks. People emerged from buildings to watch their approach, curiosity evident on weather-worn faces. Sarah saw men and women, a few children playing in the dirt street, the whole settlement having the raw, unfinished quality of a place still defining itself. Boone led them to what appeared to be the largest building, a 2-story log structure with a hand-painted sign declaring it to be Silver Creek Mercantile and Saloon. A tall, angular woman with gray-streaked hair emerged from the building, wiping her hands on an apron. "Boone, we were not expecting you back so soon." Her voice was warm, welcoming, and her sharp eyes took in Sarah with frank curiosity. "And you have brought a guest." "Martha, this is Sarah Brennan. She is a schoolteacher from Fort Laramie. I thought Silver Creek might benefit from her skills." Boone dismounted and helped Sarah down from Juniper, his hands strong and steady at her waist. "Sarah, this is Martha Sullivan. She and her husband Henry run the Mercantile, and Martha is generally acknowledged as the unofficial mayor of Silver Creek." Martha's eyebrows rose. "A schoolteacher? My stars, Boone, you have brought us treasure more valuable than any silver strike. Miss Brennan, welcome to Silver Creek. We have been praying for someone to educate our young ones. Please call me Sarah, and I hope I can be useful to your community. Boone has spoken highly of the settlement." Sarah found herself warming immediately to Martha's straightforward manner. "Come inside, both of you. You must be exhausted from the journey, and we have much to discuss." Martha ushered them into the Mercantile, calling for her husband as she went. The next few hours passed in a blur of introductions and discussions. Martha gathered several of the settlement's parents, and they questioned Sarah about her qualifications, her teaching philosophy, what she would need in terms of supplies and space. Sarah found herself relaxing as she realized these people genuinely wanted her skills, valued what she could offer their children. There was none of the condescension or subtle dismissal she had sometimes encountered at Fort Laramie, where her Boston education had marked her as simultaneously desirable and suspect. By the time the impromptu meeting broke up, Sarah had been hired at a salary only slightly less than what she had been earning at the fort, with the promise of room and board in a small cabin that currently stood empty. Several mothers had already arranged to bring their children to meet her the next day, and one of the miners had offered to build proper benches and desks for a schoolhouse they would construct before winter set in. Boone had remained present throughout, interjecting occasionally to vouch for Sarah's character, but mostly letting her speak for herself. Sarah appreciated his restraint, the way he supported her without trying to manage the situation on her behalf. As the sun set and the settlement prepared for evening, Martha showed Sarah to the cabin that would be her new home. It was small, just 2 rooms with a sleeping loft, but it was clean and sturdy, with a good fireplace and real glass in the windows. After weeks in the cramped boarding house room at Fort Laramie, it felt like a palace. It belonged to a prospector who moved on last spring, Martha explained. He signed over ownership to the settlement in exchange for supplies. It is yours for as long as you want it. We are so grateful to have you here, Sarah. A real teacher, someone who can give these children a proper education. It means everything to parents trying to build a future for their families. After Martha left, Sarah sank onto the cabin's single chair and looked around her new home. Her entire life seemed to have transformed in the span of a few days, from desperate and trapped to hopeful and free. And at the center of that transformation was Jacob Boone, the mountain man who had appeared exactly when she needed him most. There was a soft knock at the door, and Sarah opened it to find Boone standing outside, her carpet bag in hand. "I brought your belongings. I put them in the corner there." He gestured toward where he had set the bag. "I also brought some extra firewood and basic supplies to get you through the next few days until you can stock up properly." "Thank you, Boone, for everything. You have changed my life, quite literally." Sarah met his eyes, trying to communicate the depth of her gratitude. "You changed your own life, Sarah. You made the choice to refuse Thornton, to leave Fort Laramie, to come here. I just showed you there was a path. You walked it yourself." Boone shifted his weight, and for the first time since Sarah had met him, he seemed slightly uncertain. "I should let you get settled. You've had a long couple of days." "Where are you staying tonight?" Sarah asked, surprised to find she did not want him to leave just yet. "I have a cabin about a mile up the creek, back in the trees. That is my base when I am not out on a longer trapping expedition." Boone gestured vaguely toward the upper end of the valley. "But I will be around for the next week or so, restocking and repairing gear before I head back into the high country." "Then I hope I will see you again before you leave," Sarah said, and she meant it with an intensity that surprised her. Something shifted in Boone's expression, warmth and pleasure evident. "You will definitely see me again, Sarah. That is a promise." He touched his hat brim in his characteristic gesture and walked off into the gathering darkness, leaving Sarah standing in the doorway of her new home, with her heart beating faster than the mild conversation warranted. Over the next several days, Sarah threw herself into establishing her new life in Silver Creek. She met her students, a dozen children ranging from 6 to 14, all of them eager and curious, hungry for education in a way that her Fort Laramie students had rarely been. She organized her small cabin, using crates and boards donated by various settlers to create storage and work surfaces. She planned lessons and prepared materials, grateful for the basic school supplies Martha had been hoarding in hopes that a teacher would eventually arrive. And she saw Boone nearly every day. He found reasons to be in the settlement, stopping by with a brace of rabbits for her supper, helping repair a loose step on her cabin porch, bringing her a better chair he had fashioned from bent willow. They fell into an easy companionship, talking for hours about everything and nothing, discovering shared perspectives despite their vastly different backgrounds. Sarah learned that Boone had grown up in Kentucky, the youngest son of a farmer who had died when Boone was 14. His mother had indeed been forced into a marriage with a harsh man after his father's death, and Boone had left home at 16, unable to watch her suffering any longer. He had drifted west, learning the skills of wilderness survival from other trappers, and had been living in the mountains for nearly 15 years, carving out a life of independence and solitude. "Do you never get lonely?" Sarah asked one evening as they sat outside her cabin watching the stars emerge. "Living so much by yourself?" Boone was quiet for a moment, his profile sharp against the twilight sky. "Sometimes, but I chose solitude over confinement. Cities, settlements, even small towns, they all come with rules and expectations that chafe at me. Out in the mountains, I answer to no one but myself and the land. That freedom is worth the loneliness." "I think I understand that," Sarah said softly. "I chose uncertainty and struggle over a marriage that would have smothered me. Freedom does come at a price." "But it is a price worth paying," Boone said, turning to look at her. "You are building exactly the life you want here, Sarah. Teaching children who truly want to learn, living in a community that values you for your skills and character, rather than just your potential as someone's wife. That is something rare and precious." "It is," Sarah agreed. Then, gathering her courage, she added, "And I would not be here if not for you. You gave me the courage to believe I had options." "Sarah, you had that courage already. I just helped you see it." Boone's voice was gentle, and when his hand reached out to cover hers where it rested on the cabin step between them, Sarah felt a jolt of awareness so intense it stole her breath. They sat like that for a long moment, hands touching, surrounded by the night sounds of the settlement winding down for sleep. Sarah knew she should probably pull away, maintain proper decorum, but she found she did not want to. Boone's hand was warm and calloused, strong but careful, and his touch felt exactly right in a way she could not quite articulate. "I leave tomorrow," Boone said finally, reluctance evident in his tone. "The high country is calling, and I need to get back to my trap lines before the season advances too far." Sarah felt her heart sink with disappointment, though she tried to keep her face composed. "How long will you be gone?" "A month, maybe 6 weeks. I will be back before the first heavy snows to stock up on winter supplies." He turned his hand so his fingers interlaced with hers. "Sarah, I need to tell you something before I go. I did not plan any of this. When I rode into Fort Laramie, I was just looking to sell my furs and resupply. Meeting you was unexpected. Bringing you here was impulsive, motivated by nothing more than wanting to help someone in need." "I sense a but coming," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But somewhere along the way, my feelings changed. You are not just someone I helped. You are someone I think about constantly, someone whose company I seek out, not from obligation, but because being near you makes me happier than I have been in years." Boone's gray-blue eyes were intense in the starlight. "I realize this might be unwelcome. You have just escaped one man's unwanted attention. The last thing I want is to make you uncomfortable. But I could not leave without being honest about how I feel." Sarah's heart was pounding so hard she could barely hear her own thoughts over the rush of blood in her ears. "Boone, your feelings are not unwelcome, not in the least. In fact, I've been trying very hard not to acknowledge to myself how much I look forward to seeing you each day, how empty tomorrow will feel, knowing you will not come by my cabin." The smile that spread across Boone's face was radiant. "Truly?" "Truly. I do not fully understand it myself. We have known each other such a short time. But I feel something when I am with you that I have never felt before. A sense of rightness, of safety combined with excitement. You make me feel both protected and free, and I did not know those two things could coexist." Sarah found herself leaning closer to him. "But I am also frightened. My judgment may be compromised by gratitude or relief at escaping Captain Thornton. What if what I feel is not real? What if it is just a reaction to everything that has happened?" "Those are valid concerns," Boone acknowledged. "Time will tell us what is real and what is reaction. That is why I am glad I am leaving for a few weeks. It will give you time to settle into your new life here without my constant presence. If, when I return, you find you still feel this connection between us, then we will know it is not just circumstance but something genuine." "And if you return and discover your feelings have changed?" Sarah forced herself to voice her deepest fear. They will not." Boone's voice was absolutely certain. "Sarah, I'm 33 years old. I have lived a hard, independent life. I'm not given to flights of fancy or romantic delusions. What I feel for you is real and solid, and it will not change in a few weeks of absence. If anything, I suspect it will grow stronger." "Then I will be here when you return," Sarah said, "and we will see where this path leads us." Boone lifted her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles, a gesture both old-fashioned and deeply romantic. "Until I return, then. Stay safe, Sarah Brennan." "You too, Jacob Boone. The mountains can be dangerous. I have been surviving them for 15 years. I'm not about to let them claim me now when I finally have something worth coming back for." With that, Boone stood and walked away into the darkness, and Sarah remained sitting on her cabin steps for a long time, her hand still tingling from his kiss. The next morning, Sarah woke early and walked to the upper end of the settlement just in time to see Boone riding out, his pack horse loaded with supplies and gear. He saw her watching and raised a hand in farewell, and she waved back, feeling the ache of his departure like a physical pain. But she had work to do, a life to build, and she threw herself into both with determination. Her school was a resounding success from the first day. The children were eager learners, and their parents were deeply grateful and supportive. Sarah found teaching on the frontier very different from teaching at Fort Laramie. Here, education was valued as a precious opportunity rather than a social obligation. Her students came prepared to work hard, and she pushed them accordingly, introducing them to literature and history, mathematics and science, geography and philosophy. She also became integrated into the community in ways she had never experienced at Fort Laramie. The women of Silver Creek welcomed her warmly, inviting her to quilting sessions and communal cooking days, sharing vegetables from their gardens and advice on frontier living. The men treated her with respect, grateful for what she was doing for their children. Sarah felt valued not for her potential as a wife, but for her actual contributions to the community's well-being. But through it all, she found herself thinking about Boone. She would be teaching a lesson and suddenly remember the way he smiled, the rumble of his laugh, the strength of his hands. She would be preparing her supper and imagine what it would be like to cook for two, to share meals and conversation at the end of each day. She would lie in her bed in the loft and remember the way his kiss on her knuckles had sent warmth racing through her entire body. The weeks crawled by with agonizing slowness. Sarah told herself she was being foolish, that she barely knew Boone, that she was letting loneliness and gratitude masquerade as deeper feelings. But the self-lectures did nothing to diminish the steady ache of his absence or the way her heart leaped every time she heard hoofbeats approaching the settlement, hoping it might be him returning early. It was 6 weeks almost to the day when Boone finally rode back into Silver Creek. Sarah was in the midst of a reading lesson when she heard the commotion outside, the excited voices announcing Boone's return. She forced herself to continue teaching, to finish the lesson properly, even though every fiber of her being wanted to run outside immediately. When she finally dismissed her students and emerged from the mercantile building they were using as a temporary schoolhouse, she saw Boone across the settlement talking to several of the miners, his pack horse laden with furs. He looked thinner than she remembered, weathered by his weeks in the high country, but when his eyes found her across the distance, his whole face transformed with joy. He excused himself from the miners and walked toward her, and Sarah met him halfway, propriety forgotten. They stood facing each other in the middle of Silver Creek's main street, and Sarah felt as though the 6 weeks of separation were collapsing into nothing, as though no time had passed at all. "Hello, Sarah," Boone said, his voice rough with emotion. "Hello, Boone. Welcome back." Sarah was smiling so hard her face hurt. "Did you miss me?" It was a bold question, but Boone's eyes were searching her face with an intensity that demanded honesty. "Every single day," Sarah admitted. "I tried to convince myself I was being foolish, that my feelings were not real, but they never faded. If anything, they grew stronger." "Good." Boone reached out and took both her hands in his. "Because I spent 6 weeks in the mountains thinking about nothing but you, about your smile, your laugh, the way you look at the world with such fierce hope and determination, about how much I wanted to come home to you every night. Sarah, I am in love with you. Completely, irrevocably, terrifyingly in love with you." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. "I love you too, Boone. I'm not sure when it happened, maybe the moment you offered to stand with me against Captain Thornton, or maybe it was that first conversation by the creek. But I know it is real. and I know I want to build a life with you." Right there in the middle of Silver Creek, surrounded by amused and approving settlers who had been hoping for exactly this outcome, Boone pulled Sarah into his arms and kissed her. It was her first real kiss, and it was everything she had secretly dreamed a kiss could be: tender and passionate, respectful and hungry, a perfect expression of the connection that had been building between them since that first meeting. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, the gathered settlers erupted in cheers and applause. Martha Sullivan was laughing and wiping tears from her eyes, and even the gruff miners were grinning. "It is about time, Boone," one of them called out. "We have been watching you moon over that girl for weeks before you left. Glad you finally did something about it." "I think we need to have a proper conversation," Boone said to Sarah, his arms still around her. "One where we are not performing for an audience." "My cabin," Sarah suggested, and Boone nodded. They walked together through the settlement, ignoring the good-natured ribbing from various settlers. Once inside Sarah's cabin with the door closed behind them, Boone pulled her close again, this time just holding her, his chin resting on top of her head. "I miss this," he said softly. "I miss the way you feel in my arms, the way you fit perfectly against me." "I missed everything about you," Sarah confessed. "Your voice, your strength, the way you make me feel safe and challenged at the same time." "Boone, what do we do now? You live in the mountains, I live here in the settlement. How do we make this work?" "That is one of the things I thought about constantly while I was gone," Boone said. He guided her to sit beside him on the cabin's small bench. "Sarah, I need you to understand something about me. I have lived alone for 15 years because I value my independence, but independence and isolation are not the same thing. I isolated myself because I did not want to risk becoming like my stepfather, rigid and controlling. I was afraid that caring about someone would turn me into something I hate." "But you are nothing like Captain Thornton or your stepfather," Sarah protested. "You are the most respectful man I have ever known." "I know that now. Being with you showed me that I can care deeply for someone without trying to control them, that love and respect are not mutually exclusive. You make me want to be part of something larger than myself." Boone took her hands. "I am willing to compromise, Sarah. I need to continue trapping, at least for now. It is my livelihood, and a life I know well. But I can base myself here in Silver Creek, make my home here with you instead of alone in my isolated cabin. I can take shorter trips into the mountains, stay closer to the settlement so I can come back to you more frequently." "But what about your need for freedom and solitude?" Sarah asked. "I do not want you to feel trapped or resentful." "I will never feel trapped by being with you, Sarah. You are not trying to change me or mold me into something I am not. You accept me as I am. That is not entrapment, that is liberation." Boone smiled. "And there is nothing stopping you from coming with me sometimes, once you are more experienced with frontier living. I could teach you wilderness skills, and we could have adventures together in the high country during school breaks." The image Boone painted was so appealing that Sarah felt her heart expand with joy. "A life together, with room for both your wilderness and my teaching, room for both our needs and dreams." "Exactly. Sarah Brennan, will you marry me? Not because I am demanding it or threatening you, but because we love each other and want to build a life together as equal partners?" This time the tears that filled Sarah's eyes were tears of pure happiness. "Yes, Boone. Yes, I will marry you. I want to be your wife, your partner, your equal in all things." They sealed the promise with another kiss, this one deeper and more thorough, a physical expression of their commitment. When they finally broke apart, both were flushed and breathing hard. "How soon can we make this official?" Boone asked. "I want to marry you as quickly as possible." "Silver Creek does not have a minister," Sarah pointed out. "We will need to arrange something." "The circuit preacher comes through about once every 6 weeks, Boone said. "He should be here within the next 2 weeks if he's keeping his usual schedule. Or we could ride to Fort Laramie and have the ceremony performed there, though I suspect you have no desire to return to that place." Sarah shuddered at the thought of facing Captain Thornton again. "Let us wait for the circuit preacher. 2 weeks is not so long, and it will give us time to prepare properly." The news of their engagement spread through Silver Creek within hours, and the entire settlement embraced it with enthusiasm. The women immediately began planning a wedding celebration, insisting that Sarah needed a proper dress and that the mercantile's main room would be decorated for a reception. The men began construction on an expanded cabin that would serve as a home for the new couple, building onto Sarah's existing structure to create more space for Boone's gear and for the life they would build together. The circuit preacher, Reverend Thomas, arrived exactly 13 days after Boone's proposal, a cheerful, middle-aged man who had been riding the frontier settlements for 2 decades. He agreed immediately to perform the wedding ceremony, delighted to have such a happy occasion to celebrate. The wedding took place on a brilliant October afternoon, with the aspens blazing gold on the mountainsides and the air crisp with the promise of coming winter. Sarah wore a simple but beautiful dress that Martha and several other women had helped her sew, cream-colored muslin with blue ribbon trim. She had woven wildflowers into her honey-colored hair, which hung loose down her back in a departure from her usual practical bun. Boone wore new buckskin pants and a clean shirt, and he had trimmed his beard and tied his long hair back, looking simultaneously civilized and magnificently wild. When Sarah walked toward him through the gathered settlers, she saw his eyes go wide with wonder and appreciation, and she knew without a doubt that she was making the right choice. Reverend Thomas performed a simple but beautiful ceremony, speaking of partnership and mutual respect, of the sacred trust between two people who choose to walk through life together. When he asked Sarah if she took Jacob Boone as her husband, to love and honor as long as they both lived, she answered with a clear, ringing "I do" that held not a trace of doubt. And when Boone made his own vows, his voice was steady and sure. "I take you, Sarah Brennan, as my wife, my partner, my equal. I promise to respect your freedom even as I offer you my protection, to support your dreams even as you support mine, to love you with everything I am for all the days of my life." They kissed as husband and wife, with the entire settlement cheering, and Sarah felt a joy so profound it seemed to fill every cell of her body. This was nothing like the marriage Captain Thornton had tried to force upon her. This was a true partnership built on mutual respect and genuine love, freely chosen by both parties. The celebration that followed was raucous and joyful. The settlers had prepared a feast using everyone's precious supplies, determined to mark the occasion properly. There was dancing to fiddle music, toasts with whiskey and hard cider, laughter and stories shared late into the night. Sarah danced with Boone, with Martha's husband Henry, with various miners who wanted to congratulate her, and through it all she felt wrapped in the warm embrace of community acceptance and love. As the evening wound down and the settlers began drifting back to their own cabins, Boone lifted Sarah in his arms and carried her over the threshold of their newly expanded home. Inside, someone had built up the fire and left a lantern burning low, casting warm shadows over the new furniture and the proper bed that now dominated the main room. Boone set Sarah down carefully and cupped her face in his large, calloused hands. "Are you happy, Sarah?" "Happier than I ever imagined possible," she whispered. 6 months ago, I was alone in Boston, grieving my parents and facing a future of dependence and obligation. Now I am here, in this beautiful place, married to a man I love desperately, building a life of purpose and meaning. It is more than I dared to dream." "You deserve all of it and more," Boone said fiercely. "You are brave and strong and brilliant, and I will spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of you." "You are already worthy," Sarah assured him. "You gave me the courage to choose my own path. You respected my right to make my own decisions. You loved me without trying to control me. Those are gifts beyond price." Their wedding night was tender and passionate, a physical expression of the love and trust they had built. Boone was careful and patient with Sarah's inexperience, making sure her first time was filled with pleasure rather than pain. And afterward, as they lay tangled together in the marriage bed, Sarah felt a completeness she had never known before. The months that followed established the pattern of their life together. Sarah continued teaching, and she proved to be even more brilliant at it than the settlers had hoped. Under her guidance, the children of Silver Creek flourished academically, and several of them showed potential that Sarah worked hard to nurture. She wrote letters to her former contacts in Boston, requesting textbooks and supplies, determined to give her frontier students every advantage. Boone adapted to married life with surprising ease. He took shorter trapping expeditions, usually gone for a week to 10 days, rather than the months-long absences he had previously preferred. When he was in Silver Creek, he made himself useful to the community, helping with construction projects, hunting to provide meat for various families, using his wilderness expertise to guide miners to promising new sites. But their favorite times were the hours they spent alone together in their cabin. Boone taught Sarah to clean and prepare furs, to read weather signs, to identify edible plants and animal tracks. Sarah taught Boone to read and write with greater fluency, discovering he had a natural aptitude that had never been properly cultivated. They talked for hours about everything under the sun, discovering shared opinions and debating differences, learning the rhythms and patterns of each other's minds. And they loved each other with a passion that only deepened as time passed. Boone was an attentive and inventive lover, always seeking new ways to bring Sarah pleasure, and she discovered a sensual side to her nature she had never suspected existed. Their physical connection was intense and satisfying, a perfect complement to their intellectual and emotional bond. Winter settled over the mountains with dramatic finality, snow piling deep in the high country and transforming Silver Creek into an isolated white world. Boone's trapping expeditions became impossible, and he spent the long winter months in the settlement, taking on the role of hunter and protector for the entire community. Sarah found she loved having him home constantly, loved waking up beside him every morning and falling asleep in his arms every night. It was in late January, as the winter winds howled outside their warm cabin, that Sarah first suspected she might be pregnant. Her monthly courses, usually regular as clockwork, were 2 weeks late. She felt simultaneously excited and terrified, unsure how Boone would react to the news. She waited until they were alone one evening, sitting by the fire after supper, before she gathered the courage to speak. "Boone, I need to tell you something. I think I might be with child." Boone went very still, his eyes widening. Then slowly, a smile spread across his face, transforming his rough features with pure joy. "Truly? Sarah, are you certain?" "Not completely certain, but the signs are there. My courses are late and I've been feeling different lately, tired in the mornings, slightly queasy." Sarah searched his face anxiously. "Are you happy about this? We have only been married a few months. Perhaps it is too soon." "Too soon?" Boone laughed and pulled her into his lap, his arms wrapping around her protectively. "Sarah, I am thrilled. A child, our child, the physical manifestation of our love. How could I be anything but ecstatic?" Sarah felt relief wash over her, followed by her own rising joy. "I'm happy too, though I confess I'm also frightened. I do not know anything about being a mother. What if I am not good at it?" "You are brilliant at teaching children, at understanding their needs and nurturing their potential. You will be an extraordinary mother." Boone placed his hand gently over her still flat belly. "Our child will be so lucky to have you." "And lucky to have you as a father," Sarah said softly. "You will teach our son or daughter to be strong and independent, to respect others, to live with courage." "Our son or daughter will have the best of both of us," Boone agreed. "Your intelligence and determination, my wilderness skills and strength. They will be unstoppable." As winter gradually released its grip and spring brought new life to the mountains, Sarah's pregnancy progressed. Martha Sullivan, who had birthed 6 children of her own, became Sarah's guide through the physical and emotional changes. The settlement women rallied around her, sharing advice and baby clothes, preparing for the arrival of Silver Creek's first native-born child. Boone was protective to the point of being comical, insisting Sarah rest more, refusing to let her lift anything heavy, worrying constantly about her health. Sarah tolerated his hovering with amused patience, understanding it came from a place of deep love rather than any desire to control her. As her belly swelled with their growing child, Sarah continued teaching through her 7th month before finally agreeing to take a break. One of the settlement women, a former governess named Catherine, agreed to take over the school temporarily, though Sarah continued to advise and plan lessons from home. The baby came in early September, on a day when the aspens were just beginning to hint at their autumn gold. Sarah's labor was long and difficult, lasting through an entire night and into the following afternoon. Boone paced outside the cabin like a caged cougar, while Martha and 2 other women attended Sarah. and when he finally heard the thin wail of a newborn cry, he nearly broke down the door in his eagerness to see his wife and child. Sarah lay exhausted, but radiant, her hair damp with sweat, cradling a tiny bundle wrapped in soft flannel. "Boone, come meet your son." Boone approached the bed with uncharacteristic hesitation, this giant of a man suddenly unsure how to hold something so small and precious. But when Sarah placed their son in his arms, showing him how to support the tiny head, Boone gazed down at the infant with such naked wonder and love that Sarah felt tears streaming down her face. Their son had a dusting of dark hair and his father's strong features in miniature. His eyes, when they fluttered open, were the indeterminate blue of all newborns, but Sarah suspected they would eventually settle into Boone's gray blue. "He is perfect," Boone whispered. "Sarah, you are amazing. You created this miracle." "We created him together," Sarah corrected. "What should we name him?" They had discussed names throughout the pregnancy, but had not reached a final decision. Now, looking at their son, Sarah knew with sudden certainty. "I want to name him Thomas, after my father. Thomas Jacob Boone." Boone's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "Thomas Jacob. I like it. It is strong, and it honors your father. He would have loved to meet his grandson." Little Thomas proved to be a healthy, vigorous baby with powerful lungs and his father's appetite. Sarah navigated the challenges of new motherhood with the same determination she brought to everything else, though she was grateful for Martha's guidance and the support of the other settlement women. Boone was an involved and devoted father from the start. He fashioned a clever sling that allowed Sarah to carry Thomas against her chest, leaving her hands free for other tasks. He walked the floor with the baby during fussy evenings, his deep voice rumbling lullabies he half remembered from his own childhood. He was endlessly patient with the interrupted sleep and the constant demands of infant care. As Thomas grew from infant to toddler, the cabin filled with the sounds of his laughter and exploration. He was a curious, fearless child, climbing everything within reach, investigating every corner of the cabin and surrounding area. Boone built him toys from wood and leather, simple things that encouraged imagination and creativity. Sarah returned to teaching when Thomas was 6 months old, bringing him with her to the schoolhouse where the older children delighted in helping care for him. He learned to walk in the schoolroom, taking his first wobbling steps between the benches while Sarah's students cheered him on. The years passed in a blur of happiness and purpose. Sarah and Boone's love deepened with time rather than fading, their partnership growing stronger as they navigated the challenges and joys of building a life together. They had 2 more children, a daughter they named Catherine after Sarah's mother, and another son they called Samuel. Thomas grew into a strong, intelligent boy who adored both his parents and showed signs of inheriting his mother's teaching gift and his father's wilderness skills. Catherine was fierce and independent from birth, with honey-colored hair like her mother and her father's penetrating gray-blue eyes. Samuel was the baby, sweet-natured and curious, always asking questions and wanting to understand how things worked. Silver Creek grew and prospered as well, transforming from a rough mining camp into a genuine town. Sarah's school expanded into a proper building with multiple rooms, and she eventually trained 2 assistants to help handle the growing student population. Boone became one of the settlement's most respected residents, his wilderness expertise and calm strength making him a natural leader during crises. But their life was not without challenges. There were hard winters when food ran short and illness swept through the settlement. There were accidents and close calls, like the time Boone was injured by a wounded bear, and Sarah sat by his bedside for 3 days, praying he would recover. There were moments of grief, like when Martha Sullivan passed away peacefully in her sleep at the age of 68, and the entire settlement mourned the loss of their unofficial mayor. Through it all, Sarah and Boone faced every challenge together, drawing strength from their partnership and their love. They never forgot how their relationship had begun, how Boone had stood beside her when Captain Thornton tried to force her into an unwanted marriage, how he had championed her right to choose her own path. Sarah occasionally thought about that confrontation at Fort Laramie, about how differently her life might have turned out if Boone had not appeared when he did. She learned through settlers passing through that Captain Thornton had eventually resigned his commission under circumstances that were whispered about but never fully explained. She felt no satisfaction in his downfall, only gratitude that she had escaped the fate he had tried to impose upon her. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Boone took Sarah on a camping trip into the high country, leaving the children in the capable care of Catherine's former teacher, who had become a close friend. It was Sarah's first extended time in the true wilderness, and she fell in love with the mountains the way Boone had always been. They made camp beside a crystal-clear lake surrounded by towering peaks, and that evening, as they sat by the fire watching stars emerge in the darkening sky, Boone pulled Sarah close. "Do you have any regrets?" he asked. "About leaving Fort Laramie, about marrying me, about this life we have built?" Sarah turned to look at him, seeing the man she loved more deeply now than she had even on their wedding day. The years had added silver to his dark hair and deepened the lines around his eyes, but he was still the strong, capable, magnificent man who had offered her freedom instead of control, partnership instead of possession. "Not a single regret," she said firmly. "You gave me the most precious gift anyone has ever given me. You gave me the freedom to choose my own life, and I chose you. I would make that choice again every single day." Boone kissed her then, deep and slow, and Sarah felt the same thrill she had felt at their first kiss. Their love had not diminished with time or familiarity. If anything, it had grown more profound, rooted now not just in passion, but in shared history, in challenges overcome together, in the life they had built with their own hands and hearts. They made love under the stars that night, celebrating a decade of partnership and looking forward to all the decades still to come. And when they returned to Silver Creek and their children, Sarah felt complete in a way she had never imagined possible during those desperate days at Fort Laramie. The years continued to pass, bringing more changes and challenges. Thomas grew into a young man of 20, splitting his time between helping his father with trapping and assisting his mother with teaching. He had his father's size and strength combined with his mother's quick mind, and he was courting a sweet girl named Anna, whose family had settled in Silver Creek 3 years prior. Catherine, at 17, was studying to become a teacher herself, learning from her mother, while also developing her own unique approaches to education. She was passionate about expanding opportunities for girls and young women on the frontier, convinced they deserved the same educational opportunities as boys. Samuel, at 15, was still finding his path, torn between the wilderness life his father represented and the intellectual pursuits his mother embodied. Sarah suspected he would eventually forge his own unique course, combining elements of both. Sarah was in her mid-40s now, her honey-colored hair showing threads of silver, her face lined with the marks of years spent smiling and teaching and living fully. Boone was 50, his body still powerful but moving with slightly more care, his face weathered by decades of mountain sun and wind. They had slowed down somewhat, taking fewer risks, spending more evenings by the fire talking instead of dancing at settlement celebrations. But their love remained as strong as ever. They still reached for each other in the night, still shared thoughts and dreams, still laughed together over private jokes and memories. Their partnership had proved everything they had hoped it would be: equal, respectful, passionate, enduring. On a late autumn evening, as the first snow of the season dusted the peaks above Silver Creek, Sarah and Boone sat on the porch of their cabin watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Their children were grown or nearly so, building their own lives while remaining close to home. The town that had been a rough mining camp when Sarah first arrived was now a thriving community with a church, a proper school, several stores, and over 100 permanent residents. "We built something good here," Boone said, his arm around Sarah's shoulders. "Not just our family, but this whole community. You have educated dozens of children, given them tools to build better lives. I am so proud of you, Sarah." "And I am proud of you," Sarah replied, leaning into his warmth. "You showed me that strength and respect could coexist, that a strong man did not need to dominate to prove his worth. You taught our children to be both tough and tender, capable and kind. That is an incredible legacy." "Our legacy," Boone corrected. "Everything good in my life has come from loving you. You made me want to be part of something larger than myself. You showed me that connection and freedom were not mutually exclusive." Sarah tilted her face up to kiss him, this man who had changed her life in the best possible way. "Do you remember the day we met? I was sitting by that creek at Fort Laramie, desperate and trapped, and you rode up like something out of a story." "I remember thinking you were the most beautiful woman I had ever seen," Boone said, "and the bravest. You were so determined to choose your own path, even when it seemed impossible." "You made it possible," Sarah said softly. "You stood beside me and demanded I be free to choose for myself. No one had ever done that for me before. You gave me my life, Boone." "You gave me mine," he countered. "I was just surviving before I met you, existing in the wilderness without purpose beyond the next trap line. You gave me a reason to build something lasting, a reason to connect to other people, a reason to hope for more than solitude." They sat in comfortable silence as the stars began to emerge, the same stars that had witnessed their wedding night and countless other significant moments in their shared life. Inside the cabin, lamps were being lit against the gathering darkness. Soon they would go inside to warmth and light, to children and grandchildren who might stop by, to the simple domestic rhythms that had become more precious than either of them had imagined possible. Sarah thought back to that terrified young woman standing outside Fort Laramie's general store, facing Captain Thornton's threats with no idea how to escape the trap closing around her. She wished she could tell that younger self that everything would work out better than she could possibly imagine, that the mountain man who appeared by the creek would become the love of her life, that freedom and love were not competing values, but complementary ones. She had built exactly the life she wanted, on her own terms, with a partner who respected her autonomy while offering unwavering support. She had raised 3 incredible children who were growing into strong, independent adults. She had educated hundreds of frontier children, giving them tools to build better futures. And through it all, she had loved and been loved by Jacob Boone, the man who had demanded she be free to choose for herself and who had never regretted the choice she made. As they finally stood to go inside, Boone pulled Sarah close one more time. "I love you, Sarah Boone. I have loved you for 20 years, and I will love you for however many years we have left. I love you too, Jacob Boone. Thank you for giving me my freedom. Thank you for being my partner. Thank you for building this beautiful life with me." Sarah reached up to cup his weathered face in her hands. "You are the best decision I ever made." They walked inside together, closing the door against the cold mountain air, surrounded by the warmth and light of the home they had created. Outside, the first snow began to fall, soft and silent, blanketing Silver Creek in white. Inside, the Boone family gathered around the fire, sharing stories and laughter, building memories that would last long after the snow melted and the aspens turned gold again. Sarah looked around at her family, at the life she had built through courage and determination and love, and felt profound gratitude. She had escaped the cage Captain Thornton tried to construct around her. She had found freedom and purpose in the Wyoming Territory, and most importantly, she had found a love that was truly free, built on mutual respect and genuine partnership rather than coercion and control. Years later, when Sarah was an old woman with silver hair and grandchildren playing at her feet, she would still remember that first meeting by the creek at Fort Laramie. She would remember Boone's words about a woman's right to choose her own path, and how those words had changed everything. She would remember the moment she decided to refuse Captain Thornton despite the consequences, trusting that freedom was worth the risk. And she would remember every moment of the beautiful life that followed that choice, every laugh and tear, every challenge overcome, every joy shared with the man who had loved her enough to set her free. It was a legacy worth leaving, a story worth telling to the generations that followed. In the end, Sarah and Boone lived into their 70s, an remarkable achievement for frontier settlers. They passed peacefully in their sleep within months of each other, unwilling or unable to face a world without their partner. Their children and grandchildren mourned them deeply, but celebrated the incredible life they had built together. The town of Silver Creek continued to prosper, eventually becoming an incorporated municipality with Sarah's school at its heart. A plaque was placed in the school's main hall honoring Sarah Catherine Boone, pioneering educator and advocate for women's rights to self-determination. And in the small cemetery on the hill above town, 2 headstones stood side by side, marking the resting place of Sarah and Jacob Boone, beloved parents, grandparents, and community pillars. But more than any monument or plaque, their real legacy lived on in the values they had championed. That strength and respect could coexist, that love should liberate rather than constrain, that every person deserved the freedom to choose their own path. These values passed down through generations, shaping not just their own descendants, but the entire community they had helped build. And sometimes, on quiet autumn evenings when the aspens blazed gold on the mountainsides and the first snow dusted the peaks, residents of Silver Creek would tell the story of how their town's school was founded. They would speak of the brave young teacher who refused to be forced into an unwanted marriage, and the honorable mountain man who demanded she be free to choose for herself. It became a founding myth for Silver Creek, a reminder of the values upon which the community was built. The story ended not with the dramatic confrontation at Fort Laramie, but with the quiet triumph of a life well lived, a love freely chosen, and a partnership that proved what was possible when 2 people respected each other's freedom while building something larger than either could achieve alone. It was a happy ending, hard-won and deeply earned, the kind of ending that only comes from having the courage to choose your own path, and the wisdom to choose a partner who walks beside you rather than trying to drag you along behind. Sarah and Boone's story proved that true love demanded freedom, not captivity, and that the strongest partnerships were built on mutual respect rather than domination. It was a